Thank you. The next item of business is a statement by Shona Robison on Scottish Government pre-budget fiscal update. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of her statement, and therefore there should be no interventions or interruptions. I call on Shona Robison, Cabinet Secretary. Up to 15 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This Government has consistently warned of the significance of the financial challenge ahead. Prolonged Westminster austerity, the economic damage of Brexit, a global pandemic, the war in Ukraine and the cost of living crisis have all placed enormous and growing pressure on the public finances. In the last 3 years alone, cumulative CPI inflation has seen prices increase by 18.9%, diminishing how far money will go for households and governments alike. In the face of these challenges, the Scottish Government has stepped in to support people and services where it has been needed most on social security, health and public services. As set out in our 2024-25 budget, we have delivered a real terms uplift for the NHS. We've continued to tackle inequality by committing £6.1 billion in social security benefits and payments, including increasing the Scottish Child Payment to £26.70 a week, helping the families of over 325,000 under-16s who currently receive it. But we've done so without the equivalent UK Government action and their repeated failure to properly review the adequacy of funding settlements. This issue has been acutely felt across the 4 nations. Just last year, the Welsh Government had to introduce emergency savings measures in order to balance its budget, and in 22-23 the Northern Ireland Executive needed to draw down from the UK reserve. The new Labour UK Government has since confirmed the failures of the past administration, outlining that the previous UK Government, and I quote the new Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, quotes, never fully reflected the impact of inflation in departmental budgets. The Treasury's audit has estimated that this year's departmental spending budgets are at least £15 billion lower in real terms compared to 2021 spending review plans. The Chancellor has set out the £22 billion funding gap inherited from the previous administration, and the Prime Minister confirmed that the forthcoming UK budget will be painful as they seek to address the fiscal position. Now, while it's welcome that the new UK Government has accepted the diagnosis that we've given for years on the UK's public finances, their solution is sadly looking like an extension of the folly of austerity. I made clear there was a difficult financial outlook in last year's medium-term financial strategy. I set out the projected and growing gap between forecast funding and planned spending in Scotland. At the time, this was forecast to be £1 billion in 2024-25, rising to £1.9 billion by 2027-28, and I made clear that this was not sustainable, and I called on the UK Government to act. At the same time, with the powers at our own hand, I announced a range of measures at the budget 2024-25 to support the delivery of a balanced position whilst protecting public services. However, given the circumstances and the uncertainty about additional funding and further in-year pressures, I must take further and more urgent action now to ensure that we can balance the Scottish budget in 2024-25. Presiding Officer, pay continues to be a significant driver of in-year pressures, with expected additional costs of up to £0.8 billion in this financial year alone. Whilst I welcome the UK Government's acceptance of the pay review body recommendations, it remains to be seen whether the UK Government will fully fund it. Simply, if they do not fully fund the pay deals, it will leave a substantial gap between the expectations of the workforce and the available funding. In addition, we must also recognise that we have a larger public sector in Scotland relative to the rest of the UK. Our public sector workforce will need to evolve to ensure the delivery of high-quality public services within continued Westminster austerity, and I will set out more detail on our approach in the budget. Alongside pay, there are, of course, other pressures that arise in year that we must ensure are funded. There are costs that emerge due to natural demand-led changes, for example, legal aid, police and fire pensions, and the costs of accommodation for Ukrainian displaced people. And more widely, the budget must still be managed for wider operational pressures. Most notably, NHS boards are having to address the significant health and social care backlog that arose during the COVID pandemic and a recent further surge in COVID and respiratory cases. While the Scottish Government has to operate within a largely fixed budget determined by Westminster, this Government will, of course, do everything we can to protect people and the public. Of course, were Scotland an independent country, then we would not be paying the price for bad decisions taken at Westminster, whether that be years of austerity cuts, Brexit or reckless mini-budgets, all of which have taken money out of the economy and funding for public services. However, Presiding Officer, within the current devolution settlement, the fact remains that our main lever to remove these pressures in year is to reduce spending to achieve balance. And that's why I am setting out today a range of measures to support the 2024-25 budget, totalling almost £1 billion, of which up to £500 million are direct savings. The savings include up to £60 million of further savings that will be realised through the implementation of the emergency spend controls, particularly targeting recruitment, overtime, travel and marketing. As previously announced, we will not progress with the removal of rail peak fares or the concessionary fares extension to the asylum seekers pilot. We have also agreed with the local government that they can draw on specific existing programmes to fund pay deals. Collectively, these decisions amount to a further £65 million of savings. We will make a further £188 million of additional specific savings across all portfolios. This includes a reduction in resource spend on sustainable and active travel and increased interest income on Scottish Water loan balances. Full details are being shared with the Finance and Public Administration Committee and published alongside this statement. These savings should also be considered in the context of the recent and regrettable Scottish Government decision to mirror the UK Government decision not to retain universality in the winter fuel payment, which would have cost up to £160 million. At present, I am also reluctantly planning on the basis of utilising up to £460 million of additional ScotWind revenue funding. In the past, it has allowed me to protect budgets from cuts that would otherwise have been made. This includes being able to continue to support net zero expenditure. As the final year progresses and through our emergency spend controls and continued robust forecasting, I am seeking to protect as far as possible that ScotWind revenue, just as I was able to do in 2023-24. Presiding Officer, as we look ahead, it is clear that further significant action will be needed to reset the public finances onto a sustainable path. The Chancellor has made clear that UK Government funding will continue to be tightly constrained. The Prime Minister has also made clear the difficult decisions to come. Ahead of the autumn budget, we call again on the UK Government to ensure that it prioritises investment in public services and infrastructure. We know from bitter experience that yet more Westminster austerity is not the answer, and public services must be protected. However, if the Scottish Government does not act, then spending will continue to outstrip available funding. That's not sustainable, and tough decisions will be required. Annual savings alone will not address this. So all members of this place must face up to this challenge and the demands they make during the budget process to come. On public spending, our approach to the forthcoming budget will be focused on action in key areas to address spending pressures, some of which I want to highlight today. First, let me turn to health. We will take forward our vision for health and social care reform. This Government will always prioritise funding for our NHS, and in the 2025-26 budget, we will build on the record funding that we have allocated in the current financial year. We will take the twin approach of investment and reform in our health services, an approach which rightly tackles the population health challenges we face. Where necessary, that must mean realigning spend to ensure it reaches those that need it most. Beyond health, we will also continue to identify and implement opportunities to deprioritise lower impact spend and programmes across the whole of government. I will use the forthcoming budget to highlight how we will double down on reform opportunities and maximise efficiencies, with a particular focus on the operation of public bodies and driving further savings through efficiency levers. This includes opportunities around estates, procurement, fund management, digital shared services and revenue raising. On workforce, we have recruitment freezes in place across the Scottish Government for all but the most essential roles, and where appropriate, I am looking to extend that across public bodies, while ensuring that frontline services and the like of our NHS, police and fire can recruit the staff that they need. Presiding Officer, we also face significant pressures on our capital budget. The sustained high level of inflation experienced in the construction sector has permanently increased the cost of delivering infrastructure. This coincides with an expected real terms reduction to our UK capital funding of 8.7% over 5 years. This equates to a cumulative loss of over £1.3 billion between 2023-24 and 2027-28. As indicated previously, our financial transaction allocation from the UK Government has dropped by £290 million, or 62%, since 2022-23, adding to the challenge we already face. These factors combined have reduced our spending power, and we cannot afford all of our capital commitments. We will need to continue to make difficult decisions to ensure that our capital programme is affordable and deliverable. In line with our investment hierarchy, we are focusing spend on essential maintenance of our infrastructure so we can continue to deliver high-quality public services. And whilst these will be difficult choices, this Government remains committed to protecting the most vulnerable in society. Our approach to equality budgeting will be strengthened further for the 2025-26 budget by publishing the results of our gender budgeting pilot with the OECD. On tax, I can confirm that we will publish our tax strategy alongside the 2025-26 Scottish Budget, where we will set out our medium-term ambitions for the Scottish tax system. Of course, our cumulative decisions on income tax since the devolution of powers are estimated to have raised around £1.5 billion in 2024-25, compared to if we had UK rates and bans. This is additional revenue which has been used to support our vital public services. And of course, anyone who would advocate removing the progressive changes to income tax in Scotland will need to set out where the £1.5 billion of cuts would fall as a consequence. On the application of taxation, we can only go so far, given the scope of our devolved tax powers. Raising significant further revenue would require substantial reform to the tax system or the further devolution of powers. These will take time and will rely on the UK Government. It is therefore essential that we aim to grow the economy and the tax base to support a sustained flow of revenues over time. Since 2007, Scotland's economy has grown faster than the UK as a whole after accounting for population growth, and productivity has grown twice as quickly. And this, of course, has supported growth in Scottish tax revenues. Boosting economic growth is a top priority for our Government because it is key to both raising Scotland's living standards and funding the public services that we all rely upon. This is even more important given that Brexit has estimated to have left the UK economy at least £69 billion worse off compared with EU membership. And that's why our programme for Government tomorrow will set out in detail the steps it will take this year to boost fair green economic growth. As members will be aware, I recently wrote to the Finance and Public Administration Committee to provide an update on the timing of the Scottish Budget. I also stated that I intend to publish the medium-term financial strategy after the UK Government's multi-year spending review has concluded in the spring. I am giving careful consideration to the timing of a spending review in Scotland and to establishing a regular rhythm of reviews. I can confirm to Parliament that I have proposed that the next Scottish Budget takes place on the 4th of December. And I'm continuing to discuss the budget date with the Finance and Public Administration Committee and the Scottish Fiscal Commission, and will finalise this in due course. Finally, Presiding Officer, we cannot ignore the severe financial challenges that we face. We will continue to be a fiscally responsible government and balance the budget each year, as we have done every year for 17 years, and we will do so again this year. But this will mean we must unfortunately take difficult decisions along the way. I believe we can all agree on the importance of putting the public first in all that we do. And I'm calling on members across the Chamber to work together to navigate the challenges ahead in the best interests of all of the people that we have the privilege to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in her statement. I intend to allow around 30 minutes for questions, after which time we will move on to the next item of business. And it would be helpful if those members who would wish to ask a question were to press the request to speak buttons. And I call Liz Smith.
Thank you. The Scottish Fiscal Commission has made it abundantly clear that much of the pressure that is facing the country's finances is down to the Scottish Government's own decisions. For example, it cited the above-inflation pay settlements for public sector workers, the extent of the gap between the spending on devolved social security and the associated BGA funding, and, as Professor Roy said this morning, again, the fact that the Scottish economy has not been growing at the same rate as the UK economy since income tax was devolved. The Scottish Government is missing out on £624 million, which of course just happens to be very close to the total sum of the swingeing expenditure cuts that the Finance Secretary is announcing today. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary three things? Given the recent independent analysis, will the Cabinet Secretary finally put on the record that the large black hole in Scotland's public finances is a result of the actions of the Scottish Government and not the actions of Westminster? Secondly, can the Cabinet Secretary clarify the Scottish Government's tax strategy in relation to economic growth? On the one hand, we have the Deputy First Minister repeatedly warning of the dangers of the SNP's counterproductive income tax rises, which could further hamper growth and investment. But on the other hand, we have the First Minister saying that higher taxes are necessary to maintain the SNP's so-called social contract. Who is right, Cabinet Secretary? And thirdly, in light of the very hard choices that the Cabinet Secretary is outlining today and the corresponding unaffordability of many aspects of the Scottish Government's spending commitments, does the Scottish Government not agree that it is time to review universal payments, some of which are paid to better-off recipients?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, let me say to Liz Smith, our choices of a government have been to invest in social security measures like the Scottish Child Payment, keeping 100,000 children out of poverty. Now, if Liz Smith is arguing on behalf of the Conservatives that is a wrong priority, then that is for her and her party to defend in public. Secondly, on funding fair pay deals, yes, we have funded fair pay deals, and that has meant we have avoided some of the costly industrial action that we've seen blight public services in other parts of the UK, costly to the NHS in particular. So I will make no apologies for the investment decisions that we have made. And of course, she makes an important point about the Scottish Fiscal Commission, who of course also said that there is significant uncertainty about the funding that we can expect to receive from the UK Government. So in the light of the UK Government accepting the UK pay review body's recommendations, this Government is having to take the action to make sure that we can create the headroom to fund those those pay deals, because I'm assuming Liz Smith is also not arguing that we should not be paying the nurses here in Scotland the same pay deal that they're going to get in England. I'm sure she is not intending to say that. And finally, on the Scottish economy, we absolutely want to grow the Scottish economy. And of course, in terms of the emphasis being put by that, you'll see that in the programme for government tomorrow in terms of the green and fair economy. But we are also investing more than £5 billion this year to support economic growth. Scotland is absolutely open for business. You can see from the figures around productivity and growth that the Scottish economy is doing rather better than Liz Smith and her colleagues would have us believe, and we will continue to make the investments to ensure that that's the case.
I call Michael Mara.
Presiding Officer, instead of gripping their government's crisis in Scotland's public finances, this statement is a threadbare attempt to once again pass the buck. After 17 years in power, always someone else to blame, again and again. Because what the public must know is that all of the independent experts, the Fraser of Allender Institute, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Audit Scotland, the Scottish Fiscal Commission, all of them are absolutely clear that these SNP cuts stem from this SNP government's incompetence. It's SNP mismanagement of the public's money from a government that I'm afraid has long since lost its way. And the culture of always blaming someone else comes with a cost, and it's meted out in jobs and service cuts. When we have the longest NHS waiting lists in history and attainment is dropping in our schools. Scots are left paying more and getting less. And almost half of the total adjustments laid out today are pulled from a one-off raid on Scotland money, lost now into the black hole rather than investing for our future. It almost guarantees that this cycle of short-term sticking plaster politics will run and run. So, Presiding Officer, when will the Finance Secretary publish the real, full details, frankly any details, of these incompetent cuts? And because after 3 years of annual chaotic emergency spending reviews and what looks like another exercise in kicking the can down the road, will she confirm today what the date of next year's crisis cut statement will be, so we can all get it in the diary?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first of all, I think Michael Mara should read my lips. Labour austerity is as damaging as Tory austerity when it comes to public service cuts. And for Michael Mara to come to this chamber on behalf of the Labour Party, where the Labour Prime Minister has announced in the gardens of Downing Street that there is a difficult, tough budget coming, immediately after the Labour Chancellor announcing £22 billion of public sector funding reductions, it is a bit rich for Michael Mara to come here and lecture anyone about the public finances. I'm also assuming from what Michael Mara said that if he was standing in this position, he would make another £460 million of cuts rather than utilising the ScotWind resources. ScotWind resources that this government has enabled to happen here in Scotland that have supported public finances. So let's cut to the chase here. We are going to see Labour presiding over austerity and cuts that make the Tory cuts look like a pale imitation, and yet will come here and try to make out that somehow Scotland is some exception here, unlike in Wales, where his colleagues have had to make extremely difficult decisions because of austerity, and the same issue in Northern Ireland, where they have not been able to balance their budget. All of us are facing the same problems, and we will point out exactly where the root of them lies.
I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I recognise the financial challenges we face, although it's important to note the budget will be fully spent as resources are reallocated into pay. In times of adversity and with increasing demands on services, we must deliver more efficiently, not least through digitisation, while growing the economy, improving productivity and widening the tax base. Can the Cabinet Secretary explain how she will prioritise investment, partnering with the private sector where Scotland is globally competitive, such as in life sciences, financial services, information technology and food and drink, to create and sustain skilled, well-paid employment?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the Scottish Government and, of course, its enterprise agencies and the Scottish National Investment Bank will work very closely with the private sector to drive the growth in all of those sectors that Kenny Gibson mentioned. And, of course, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen the annual results of both the Bank and Scottish Enterprise demonstrating their impact on investment. So since the launch, the Bank has committed £645 million and brought in a further £1 billion in additional third-party investment into 35 businesses and projects. And last year, Scottish Enterprise helped companies raise over £350 million of growth funding, unlocking nearly £1.9 billion in capital investment for companies and delivering over £2 billion of planned international sales. I think that is a good record of success and we want to see more of it.
I call Murdo Fraser to be followed by Michelle Thompson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Growth in the economy is essential to provide the additional revenues we require to fund public services. But the reality is that since 2014, over the last decade, the Scottish economy has grown on average at one-half the rate of the UK as a whole. Previously, the Scottish Government cut employability programmes, the very initiatives that help economic inclusion and drive growth. So what assessment has been made of the impact on growth of all the extra cuts that have just been announced today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, all of the assessments have been done on all of the savings have sought to minimise the impact on all of the government's priorities. But there's no getting away from the fact that in order to make sure we balance our budget this year, difficult decisions have had to be made, and we have tried to avoid the impact on public services and on frontline services where we can. Despite some of the cuts that Murdo Fraser has referred to, we are seeing absolutely fantastic performance from Scottish Enterprise and the Scottish National Investment Bank. And the figures I laid out in my statement around the performance of the Scottish economy, I know it's not the narrative that the Scottish Conservatives like to hear, but actually the Scottish economy is doing rather well. Is there room for it to do better? Yes, there is, and that's why in the programme for government, Parliament will hear more about the focus on the green, fair economy and the measures we're going to put in place to make sure we maximise the potential there.
I call Michelle Thompson, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Now, I note the Scottish Government intends to use up to 100% of ScotWind monies available from year 2023 to 2024, i.e. £460 million to fund day-to-day resource spending. Given this is a one-off bounty, the original intention had been to help develop vital supply chains and infrastructure in our renewable sector, and it could also have been used as a tool to crowd in private capital. However, the use of the term up to is key, so can the Cabinet Secretary set out the circumstances where these vital one-off funds can and will be protected and invested to create future wealth for Scotland, such as a sovereign wealth fund? And can she also outline her intention for the remaining £200 million available in year 2024 to 2025? Is that also being earmarked for day-to-day spending?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say to Michelle Thompson, as I said in my statement, it is not what I would want to be doing in having to utilise ScotWind monies for day-to-day spend. But given the choice in front of us, with the in-year levers essentially being spending control being the main lever that we have at our disposal, then I would have to go further and deeper on spending reductions in order to minimise the ScotWind utilisation. Now, having said that, as I also laid out in my statement, because of the actions we took last year, we were able to reduce the call upon ScotWind resources through the year, and then we drew down less than we had anticipated having to do. It would be absolutely my intention to try to do that this year. because Michelle Thompson makes a very good point. Whether it's about using Scotland to invest in infrastructure or indeed making sure we have Scotland as a backstop in future years, that will absolutely be my intention. I'm happy to keep Parliament updated on the progress of doing so.
I call Daniel Johnson to be followed by
Thank
Stuart
you,
McMillan.
Deputy Presiding Officer. I'd just like to push the Cabinet Secretary for Finance on this point. She's identified a £1 billion shortfall in the Scottish Government's funding before we've even had a budget from the UK Government, that she seeks to fill using £460 million of Scotland money. Can she confirm that is non-recurring? And if so, does that not mean that she's just simply going to have to find another £500 million worth of cuts in the budget when she publishes it on the 4th of December?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the budget that I publish on the 4th of December, of course, will be guided very much by what the Labour Chancellor publishes at the end of October. Now, if what the member is saying to me is that it's going to be so grim that I'm going to have to set out a further £500 million of cuts, then I am deeply disturbed by that prospect. Let's be really clear, the vast majority of funding for the Scottish Government is reliant upon UK Government budget decisions. End of. That is a fact. In terms of the levers we have, I've already said to Michelle Thompson, of course we want to utilise Scotland over a number of years rather than having to use it in 1 year, because it is, as Daniel Johnson said, non-recurring. And I will do my level best to avoid having to do that. The pressure this year, in the main, emanates from pay pressure. £800 million of additional pay pressure driven by the acceptance of the UK pay review bodies. And that is not at the moment confirmed that it will be fully funded. In the absence of that being fully funded, we have to create the headroom in order to pay for Agenda for Change and other pay deals, because I am assuming that Daniel Johnson is not suggesting that we don't pay our nurses or our doctors or our teachers the pay uplifts that are being given elsewhere. So in the light of that, we have to make sure we have the headroom to pay for the pay deals. I'm happy to explain it in further detail to Daniel Johnson if he requires.
Can I just take this opportunity to say to our friends on these benches that we must have much less chuntering while somebody else has the floor. Thank you. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Finance Secretary spoke about NHS reform in her statement. And can the Finance Secretary provide an assurance that the free eye test will remain, as they have multiple benefits for people and also their eye health care?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, quite obviously the Labour bench doesn't really care about eye health care. So let me say to Stuart McMillan, Scotland is the only country in the UK to provide free universal NHS funded eye examinations, and maintaining this is a Scottish Government commitment. It's critical that flagship services such as this are protected so that patients have no financial barriers to accessing services, and that we have the capacity to support safe, high-quality management of patients in the community. And I hope that reassures Stuart McMillan.
I call Ross Greer to be followed by Jackie Dunbar. Thank
you. Wes Streeton was right to say that all roads lead back to Westminster. Nowhere is that more true than the last 14 years of cuts to public services. But the Scottish Government has choices. The SNP have chosen to slash spending on climate action, hitting budgets for nature restoration, walking, wheeling, cycling, bringing back peak rail fares and raiding Scotland offshore wind income. Contrast that to the untouched £700 million of business tax breaks, £250 million of which is the SBBS, a scheme for which the Government's own independent review could find no evidence of enhanced business outcomes, and which, despite having small business in the name, throws public money at large and extremely profitable companies and even at the shooting estates of the landed elite. So why have the SNP chosen to continue handing public cash to big business and elite landowners while slashing critical spending to tackle the climate emergency?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, let me first of all, on a point of agreement with Ross Greer about all roads lead to Westminster, as Wes Streeting made clear during the election campaign, and we agree with him on that point. In terms of the choices that we can make in year, as Ross Greer will know, there are very limited options when you're trying to balance budget in year. That is a different matter from budget choices that we may choose or not choose to make, and that is when we will set out our tax and spending plans. But in year, we have to take the difficult choices, and many of those are choices of programmes that are not yet underway. And unfortunately, many of those are in the active travel area. That does not diminish the fact that we have put significantly more resources into active travel, and we will continue to do so. But the programmes that have been impacted here, unfortunately, were required in order to make sure we can balance the budget.
I call Jackie Dunbar to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The UK Government's spending plans are going to have substantial implications for Scotland's budget next year. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary to provide any further information regarding when the Scottish Government expects to receive further detail regarding the consequentials which it will receive for 2024-25?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks. Can I thank Jackie Dunbar for her question? So the Scottish Government continues to discuss the overall financial position with the Treasury, and on another point of consensus and positivity, because I'm obviously always full of positivity, the Treasury in their day-to-day communications with the Scottish Government, there has been a marked improvement, I would have to say, and that is helpful in terms of the relationship and the flow of communication. So let me put that on record. But final Barnett consequentials will not be confirmed until UK supplementary estimates, which completes in late January, early February, although I would expect some formal indication of additional funding at the UK budget on the 30th of October. Now, what we do know from what the Prime Minister has said is that that budget is likely to be extremely difficult. What we don't know as yet is what departments will be particularly hit by those budget decisions. And of course, if those are devolved areas of spend, then that directly impacts on the budget available in Scotland, and we will set all of that out in due course.
I call Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Across Scotland, all of our constituents are working harder, but it feels like they're falling further behind. They're just not buying these excuses anymore. Now, the SNP for decades lectured Margaret Thatcher about failing to create a sovereign wealth fund for the oil that was found underneath Scotland's seabed. Now, that's exactly what it's failed to do in terms of the wind farms now being built upon it. Now, when the government draws down this £460 million, as we know they very well might, as Daniel Johnson says, that is a one-off spend. That is a hole that will need to be filled next year. I want to understand from the government, the Finance Secretary, how she intends to fill that, or are there other one-off expenses that we'll just have to make do with?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I say to Alex Cole-Hamilton that we, of course, unlike other independent countries that have developed sovereign wealth funds, who have all the fiscal levers available to them, we do not have those fiscal levers. The only fiscal lever we have in year to meet pressures like pay review body recommendations being accepted but not fully funded are spending reductions. Now, if I was to contain the Scotland revenues intact, I'm afraid I would be coming here and announcing a further £460 million of public spending reductions. And I'm sure that Alex Cole-Hamilton would not want me to do that as my first priority, given what that would mean. Having said that, and I hope I've been clear on this point, I will do everything within my power to drive down the utilisation of the Scotland revenues, for all of the reasons that we understand have been articulated in this chamber. I did that last year and drew down much less than we had anticipated having to do, and I will do the same this year as well.
I call Christine Graham to be followed by Pam Gozo.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The Labour Government's first move, of course not in their manifesto, was to base winter fuel payment on pension credit, knowing that 40% entitled do not claim. And of course they cut our funding to make it universal. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that Labour should explain and indeed apologise to the estimated 929 households in my constituency, Midlothian South and Tweeddale, which have not claimed pension credit, will lose this vital support in winters actually incredibly colder than those in London and the home counties where these decisions are taken.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think it is one of the most regrettable decisions that the UK Labour government have made, and of course didn't tell anyone about it during the election campaign, and nor would they of course accept the public expenditure cuts that the First Minister told them was coming down the line, and that was denied. And yet here we are, with all of the Labour austerity being laid out, a difficult budget coming, and of course the changes to winter fuel payment removing that benefit from millions and millions of pensioners. Unfortunately, the Scottish Government's position is I cannot find £160 million from other budgets, whether it's the health budget or anywhere else, to replace the money that we will not secure from the UK Government for winter fuel payments. I have no choice in that matter, but I think, as Christine Graham has said, it is a deeply disturbing and upsetting decision, particularly given the climate here in Scotland.
I call Pam Gozo to be followed by Jackie Baillie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Caroline Lamb, the Director-General for Health and Social Care, has said that funding for Scotland's public services have reached a tipping point and implied that the universal benefits cut may be on the cards. Will the Cabinet Secretary confirm whether this is correct?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first of all, let me say to Pam Gosal that, of course, the 2024-25 budget provided funding of over £19.5 billion for health and social care, giving our NHS a real terms uplift. Reform, though, of how health and social care services operate has never been more urgent, and I set that out in the statement in terms of that being a priority. In terms of the decisions going forward around those difficult decisions, and of course we believe that many of those investments are absolutely vital, whether that's in our system of free university education and not putting financial barriers in the way of young people getting an education, and not putting financial barriers in the way of people accessing their prescriptions, for example. These are really important things that have been invested in and built upon. Does that mean there are not difficult decisions to make as part of the budget process? No, of course there will be difficult decisions to make as part of the budget process, and we'll set out the decisions that we're making when I come on the 4th of December.
I call Jackie Baillie to be followed by James Storley.
In a letter to Health Board's Caroline Lamb, the Chief Executive of the NHS warned that there is a £1.1 billion black hole at the heart of the NHS budget for this year. In the documents provided by the Cabinet Secretary today, she has slashed a further £115 million from the health and social care budget, from mental health services, from primary care services, from the Independent Living Fund, an attack on disabled people in our community. How is that protecting NHS and social care? And the Cabinet Secretary talks about prioritising essential NHS jobs. So why are there vacancy freezes for consultants and nurses? Are they not essential jobs?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first of all, on the Independent Living Fund, Jackie Baillie should be accurate in this chamber. Of course, the Independent Living Fund is based on what the predicted number of applicants is going to be for the Independent Living Fund that we, of course, have re-established here in Scotland. I don't think it's going to be re-established in England, where, of course, Labour are in power. In terms of the mental health services, of course, we have continued to invest in mental health services in excess of £1.3 billion for mental health, and that includes £120 million of direct funding to NHS boards and IJBs. Does this mean that health and social care is immune from some of these difficult decisions? No, it doesn't. But I know that colleagues, Neil Gray and his team, have worked extremely hard to make sure that the £115 million will have the minimal impact on frontline services. And finally, on the payment of nurses and doctors. That's exactly why we want to meet the pay review body recommendations, in order to make sure that nurses and doctors are paid. We have done that in Scotland, where we have seen nurses and doctors on strike in other parts of the UK, but we have made sure through fair funding we have avoided industrial action in the health service here in Scotland. And in terms of those urgent posts, those emergency cuts, I have made very clear again, if Jackie Baillie had been listening, that essential posts on front line, whether it's in health, police or fire, will be protected in terms of recruitment. So let me just put that on the record again for the avoidance of doubt, Presiding Officer.
I call James Doran, who's joining us remotely, to be followed by Brian Whittle. Mr Doran.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, the new Labour government at Westminster has the levers to end austerity, but they're choosing not to. Do you agree with me that the case couldn't be clearer for full fiscal powers to be devolved to Scotland, so we can deliver the investment in public services in our communities that people deserve?
Cabinet Secretary.
Can I agree with James Doran in that we are doing all that we can within the limited powers that we have. But of course we could do so much more with the full set of fiscal powers that other European countries of our size have at their disposal. And if we did have those full fiscal powers, we would not be paying the price for bad decisions taken at Westminster, whether that be the years of austerity cuts started under the Tories, now continued under Labour, Brexit, reckless mini-budgets, all of which have taken money out of the economy and funding for public services reductions. So I'll continue to make the case for this Parliament to have the fiscal powers of a normal independent country. But in the meantime, we need the Chancellor to use her forthcoming budget to provide the funding that our public services, infrastructure and communities so badly need.
I call Brian Whittle to be followed by Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Nowhere in the Cabinet Secretary's statement did she acknowledge the importance of the private sector to economic growth or the opportunities presented from unlocking greater private sector investment. Was this an oversight, or yet more evidence that this is a Scottish Government where business and entrepreneurship is always an afterthought?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Brian Whittle should have listened more closely to my statement, because I literally talked about our absolute commitment to economic growth. I talked about the look ahead to the programme for government that was going to focus on fair green growth and the levers that we would use in order to do that. And of course we've seen in terms of the positive aspects of the Scottish economy, I outlined some of those earlier on, we see record levels of foreign direct investment beyond anywhere else in these islands. Presiding Officer. So, I know that Brian Whittle will not want to hear these positive aspects of the Scottish economy, but for the avoidance of doubt, again, let me say that economic growth and green economic growth is absolutely key to the future success of this country, and you'll hear more about that tomorrow in the programme for government.
And I can squeeze in Audrey Nicholl to be followed by John Mason if both members are brief. Audrey Nicholl.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Cabinet Secretary understands the significant role of community justice approaches in their contribution to a whole range of national outcomes, including reducing reoffending, addressing homelessness and tackling child poverty. So given the new Labour government at Westminster are already turning their backs on the most vulnerable, what assurance can the Cabinet Secretary provide that funding in this vital space will be sufficient to support continued delivery of community justice approaches, particularly given the pressures being faced in other parts of the justice system?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Audrey Nicholl makes a good point, and of course we are investing a total of £148 million in community justice this year. This includes an additional £14 million which will build the capacity of justice social work services and strengthen alternatives to custody across Scotland. And this increased investment underlines the Scottish Government's continued commitment to community justice and reflects evidence that such approaches can be more effective than short-term imprisonment at reducing reoffending, assisting with rehabilitation and ultimately ensuring there are fewer victims of crime.
And I call John Mason.
Thank you very much. It was encouraging that the Cabinet Secretary said that she has a slightly better relationship with the Westminster Government than previously. Has she had any indication or hope that in the area of capital expenditure and maybe financial transactions, Westminster might allow a bit more leeway?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I have to say to John Mason, it is a very low bar, but the signals in terms of communication have been a marked improvement. So the issue of capital investment, which of course will form part of the spending review of the UK Government that will be produced in the spring, and the issue of financial transactions, the First Minister and I raised those directly with the Chancellor when we met her last week, I think it was. And we impressed upon her the importance of being able to invest in our infrastructure, and from not from a public service point of view, but also from an economic point of view. So we were very, very clear why that was important, and I will continue to press that point with her and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. That concludes the statement. I allowed it to run on a wee bit, but we do have to protect the rest of the afternoon's business. There will be a short pause before we move on to that to allow frontbench teams to change position, should they so wish. Thank you.